I would like to welcome up the woman we all know and love, the 2018 Women's Chamber Business Leader of the Year, here to cover the economic conditions and outlook for the Pikes Peak region, Dr. Tatiana Bailey of the College of Business and Administration at UCCS.
I think Tim didn't believe me when I told him that this town actually likes economists. It's true. It's true. So I'm going to jump right in. We have a sponsored happy hour this year, so I know everyone wants me to keep things moving along. Of course, I have to always start with thanking my sponsors. Here we have the platinum level sponsors, FBB Group, Ent, and Wells Fargo. FBB Group being one of the founding sponsors, Ron Chernak, and we're now in our 22nd year. And then our gold and media sponsors, our silver level sponsors. All of these and the above get presentations as part of sponsorship. And then sustaining level sponsors. And I really am incredibly thankful to this community for that incredible level of support. So, normally I talk about the national, state, and local economies. I'm going to spend very little time on the national economy because when I saw Tim's presentation, I thought he does such an amazing job, I don't really need to go into too much detail. So, just a few indicators to highlight some of the forecasts that the forum has. So Tim talked about GDP. The only two things I'd like to highlight here, trending back, is that the GDP estimates that I have, which are the same as the Colorado Office of State Planning and Budgeting, are a little bit lower than the Wells Fargo small font that Tim showed you of 2.6%. I have large font here, but the reason that they're a little bit lower, I'll talk about more in a second. And then the other thing I'd like to show is the estimates for GSP, gross state product, and GMP, gross metropolitan product for Colorado Springs. This is the first time I've ever stood up here for this presentation and given forecasts for growth for our region that are about the same as the state, because typically Colorado Springs has performed at a lower level, but now we're looking at pretty much the same growth rate. Now, part of the reason that I, am a little more bearish, not much, but a little more bearish for 2019 is because the Atlanta Federal Reserve does this GDP now. It's completely objective. It's just taking a look in between quarters. What are the indicators showing us? So it's kind of real-time GDP estimates. And of course, as we all know, in Q2, growth was very high. Tim talked about that at 4.2%. But, for Q3, the Fed was originally saying, and Atlanta Fed was saying, we're looking at 4.4% for Q3. Incredible, right? But then they revised it to 4.1, 3.8, 3.6. So they're looking at it, coming down a little bit. And I think it's mostly because it's hard to say how long we're going to have the impact of the tax cuts. So I think it's maybe not quite as long as they originally thought. And they're saying that it's mostly due to the drag of imports and a little bit of slowdown in personal consumption expenditures. So where is GDP headed? Well, many experts expect the net exports to be pulled down by about a percentage point by GDP. Consumer spending is still very robust, but that actually also boosts our demand for imports, right, for foreign-made goods, which pulls down our trade deficit. And in fact, imports are up in 5 out of the 6 major categories for the last several months. And then, of course, also the dollar is higher, 6% higher than it was looking back to January, making our goods more expensive to foreigners. So that also pulls down our net exports. And then, we do still obviously have some steam left in the fiscal stimulus and the tax cuts, so that's a positive. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is from the Executive Office, states that Q2 growth was about 1.1 percentage point higher than potential GDP. And potential GDP is just looking at what's sustainable in the long run. So I pay a lot of attention to that as well. Now, Tim likes using the conference board. Tim, I suggest you change to University of Michigan. This is a much better index. But the thing that I'd like to highlight here is that their forecast has been pretty consistently high in terms of personal consumption expenditures at 2.6%. That's a pretty good annual rate of increase over the next 12 months. Good news for any business that caters to local and national consumers. Now, that's the highest reading, third highest reading since 2004. The thing that I'd like to highlight here, and that's amazing, is that these gains have happened across all socioeconomic groups for the past couple of years. That's saying something, and in fact, the high September reading is mostly due to an upward movement of the bottom third of household income groups. And they continue to say that they have very high prospects for jobs, for income, continued low unemployment. And then the one thing that they did state as being the biggest sort of potential barrier moving forward for growth are tariffs. No great surprise. A full third of respondents said they're concerned about tariffs. Now, this I think, is also very important because previously, you can see, prior to the last Great Recession, the savings rate always goes down. People get sort of overconfident and they overspend. And then a few months ago, it looked like the savings rate was going down again. However, there were some revisions made, and it's now at about 6.7%. That's pretty high. Why is this good? Not just that it's an indicator, but also it's great because if we do have a downturn, people have that much more disposable income. They're not necessarily having to scrape the bottom of the barrel in terms of meeting their financial obligations. So this really creates resiliency. Businesses are indeed very optimistic at this point. You can see right around the time of the election, 2016 is when Small Business Optimism Index went high. In the 45 years that they have been conducting this survey, we're now at the highest level. So it is indeed the highest level of 45 years, and that's part of the reason that I think we can probably eke out this economic expansion a little bit longer. If you look at the survey results, about a third of respondents say they have had to increase compensation, which is good, but it also means more wage push inflation. About a third of employers have job openings, which means unemployment rate's probably going to fall lower. About a quarter of them saying they're going to create jobs in the next 3 months. About a third saying that it's good time to expand. And over half reporting that they have some type of capital outlay. A little different than what Tim showed, but remember, a capital outlay can be a new company car, it can be a piece of equipment, and so forth. And then labor quality is still stated as the #1 problem in terms of 25% of them fully saying that they can't find the qualified labor. Now, Tim already talked about interest rates, but going back to '74, the only thing I like to highlight here is that you can see that the Fed has increased interest rates just about every time before a recession, and they do that to slow down the economy. But this graph kind of begs the question of, is it a little too much medicine? So it's only taken data going back to 1974 for the Fed to finally figure out that maybe they've been giving a little too much medicine. And in fact, Yellen and Powell have said, we're going to do very gradual rate increases. And this graph, supports the fact that that's maybe not a bad idea. Consumer prices, I just like to highlight the blue line is the Western region. Inflation has been very slow to pick up, especially this late in an economic expansion. The little green bar there is the Denver-Boulder-Greeley index, just showing that we are really about as expensive as the Western region, which of course is pulled up by California. But why is it that inflation is not really picking up the way it usually does? I believe that there are really some structural limits to inflation here, because usually unemployment causes wages to rise. Businesses pass that on to consumers. But I think there are 3 things that are really causing things to be a bit different right now. #1, healthcare costs. If employers have to continually deal with high healthcare costs, it's going to be more difficult for them to increase wages as much as they would like. #2, e-commerce has introduced a new level of competition in capitalism. Absolutely, right? That keeps prices low. And capitalism has done the same thing, basically. So I always get asked about this in presentations. So, when is the next recession? What's going on? Well, we have some factors hinting at a slowdown. The low unemployment rate, inflation, potentially more inflation due to trade wars, inflation concerns precipitating the interest rate hikes that we all know are coming, but we don't know. Is it 2? Is it 4? How many? The leveling of worker productivity. We do have an aging population and a low labor participation rate, particularly for young people. And then on top of that, also a skills gap. We are aware of that. We do have probably some further restrictions in immigration, which will further contract our labor supply. Maybe a little bit of overexuberance in some aspects of the market. And then remember that the growth that we have going on right now is actually a good thing and pretty consistent across countries, but a lot of times when you have a contraction, it then trickles down to other countries as well. So that could be a simultaneous contraction. And then longer term, Tim talked about the debt. It is possible that we may have some downgrading of U.S. Treasuries because of the high debt. And this is, of course, very much down the road. What I pay attention to is the number of factors we have here and the possible confluence of these factors. Could 2 or 3 or 4 of them hit at the same time? Now, just a couple words on the debt. Corporate profits were very high in Q2, the largest year-over-year gain in 6 years. They grew by 16% over the past year. They were already high even before then. The federal taxes, which all sounds very good, and I think we all agree the corporate tax rate needed to change. The downside, of course, is that federal tax receipts came down by 33%. So the Office of Management and Budget, which is actually Trump's entity that looks at all of this, so he refutes it sometimes, but it's his office, says that the debt will be about $1 trillion higher in the next decade, as Tim said, or $100 billion more a year. And this is mostly, not fully, but mostly due to the tax laws that changed. But this is the interesting thing. Usually you do that type of stimulus when you're in a downturn to stimulate the economy, not when things are already going quite well. And that's part of why we have that exacerbated deficit that Tim alluded to. Now, I'm not a good economist unless I say, on the other hand, we have some really good factors hinting at some more continued growth, at least for the short term. Consumers are still confident. Major global economies are growing. We have increased demand for our goods. Manufacturing indices are high. The Tax Act has propped up some business confidence, more CapEx, and the stock market has been rallying. These are short-term impacts. We are seeing some modest increase in labor participation, and that's good because that keeps unemployment from falling too low without companies having to raise wages, and they can still find some workers to increase their output, and I'll talk more about that locally in a minute. Interest rates are still very low, and then, as I mentioned, the Great Recession has created some resiliency. Banks are still relatively cautious, and consumers are still saving, which is a good thing. Now, I wrote an article about this that was in the paper this past week in the Gazette, and I think that this is a really important thing to look at nationally, but also locally. What are some of our cyclical forces, things that are going to happen? Business cycles are going to happen. And then what are some of our structural forces? Well, in the short term, the cyclical forces, we have the tax cuts, looks like a good thing. The downside, of course, the structural is the deficit and the debt. On the left, low unemployment. No one's going to argue that's a great thing. But on the other side of that, we do have an aging population and a skills gap, something we all have to closely pay attention to. Inflation, and higher interest rates in the short term, that does dampen the economy. But I think the probably bigger issue we should also be paying attention to is longer term. What about these high healthcare costs and high education costs? And then lastly, we don't know yet what the outcome is really going to be of these tariffs, but it does look like there could be a slowdown in some global trade that could be short or long term. Could we maybe end up with better terms of trade? That's a big question, right? We don't know. So, looking at unemployment, you can see here that the Forum has forecasts very similar to Wells Fargo in terms of continued low unemployment rate, lowest since 1969. These are the industries that have grown the most in the last 12 months. Business and professional services, healthcare, construction. Take a good look at these because these are remarkably similar to our local industries that are growing the most. And I like that it's a nice mix of high, middle, and low skill jobs that we're looking at right now. And this is across the US, August to August. Back to the structural. let's pay attention to some of the sectors that are growing the most, the occupations that are growing the most. So basically from now until 2026, if you look at all of these, there's a preponderance of healthcare jobs, IT jobs, nursing, construction, and so forth. And actually only 3 that I would consider higher wage jobs. So that's one thing to look at. And then if we look at growth rate, which occupations are growing at the fastest rate between now and 2026, this tells me a lot in terms of where we're headed in our economy. Again, we're seeing, look at number 1 and number 2, solar panel installers, wind turbine technicians, a lot on healthcare, statistics and math, and medical assistants and so forth, and quite a few more in the higher wage region. So what does that tell me? Well, healthcare is going to continue to grow because we're getting old and decrepit. Software engineering, because technological change affects just about everything, right? Computers are in everything. Statisticians and mathematicians, because we're needed to interpret the big data, right? The energy sector is definitely going to have a high level of disruption in the next 10 years. And then I really do think that our global competitiveness will hinge upon our ability to really look at this and do something about it. And then I always talk about that red line, the civilian participation rate, the proportion of people who are participating in the labor force. So I have the updated numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We are starting to see in the prime working ages at the top, 25 to 54, a little bit of upward movement. People coming back into the labor force or entering. The thing that does continue to concern me is how the 20 to 24-year-olds still do stay quite low. And then look at the 55 plus. They are still holding out and working at a high rate. Now, it's true the baby boomers retiring are going to impact us, but it's not all the baby boomers, as I always say, because if you look at the size of the bubble, which on this screen is enormous from up here, you can see here that the largest one is actually the 25 to 34-year-olds. That is the largest number of unemployed people in the US. So definitely a structural issue we're talking about. And then just to kind of back it up, let's look at some other countries in the labor participation rate for ages 25 to 34. We're much lower for this age group than Germany, Canada, and the UK. That tells me something. Now, a piece of good news. Colorado truly does buck this trend, because if you look at in 2017, we had the largest increase in the employment to population ratio across the US, 1.3 percentage points higher in 1 year. The highest was North Dakota at almost 70. We were not far behind at 66%. US on average was only 60%, and the lowest was 50% in West Virginia. Think about that. We have a 16 percentage point advantage over West Virginia in terms of the percentage of workers and that potential output that goes with that. Now, a little bit of housing, which makes up 15% of GDP. You can see now, unlike previous years, the average and median household price is now higher than it was prior to the recession. This is an annual chart, and you can see my little lines up at the top there for average and median price show you where we are in August. We continue on that upward trajectory. 90% of single family and condos showed increases across all of the 178 cities that National Association of Realtors looks at. The median price in Q2 for single family homes was almost $270, up 5.3%. Remember that percentage. And then median condo price was $248,000. Now, affordability. About 31% of buyers in August were first-time buyers, which is very low historically. First-time buyers are, of course, squeezed out of the market because of low inventory, higher prices, and now increasing mortgage rates. And when surveyed, renters say they would be willing to buy, but there just aren't enough homes in their price range. So if we could ameliorate that problem, we would probably have an even hotter housing market, and probably not the cool down that we're starting to see. Most MSAs appear to be underbuilding relative to demand, according to NAR, National Association of Realtors. So how much home can you buy across the United States with $200,000? Well, in Denver, you can see you get 661 square feet. Compare that to Cleveland, 3,800 square feet, but of course Ohio State fans live there, so that's not too surprising. And then over here you can also see Denver, how tiny. I mean, this puts it in perspective. You really can't get a lot of house in Denver. Now, what about building projections? Well, home builders still saying there's a lot of demand in their areas across all price ranges, but building has decelerated a little bit, as has the overall housing market. And most builders across the nation are saying there's a shortage of zoned land and high labor and material costs, which is pretty similar to what I've heard here locally. The National Association of Home Builders projects single-family housing starts to increase by about 5% per year. This year, next, in 2020. And then for multifamily, up 5.5% this year, but then decreasing in 2019 by 7% and 2020 3%. So a little bit of a cool down in the multifamily scene. Now, what about the Colorado state economy? So here you can see, I've shown earlier GDP, the red line is gross state product. Colorado started really outperforming the US in 2012. We kind of didn't do as well in 2016, but now we're on this nice steady path of being about a percentage point higher than the US. And you can see what the projections are in terms of growth rates up in the box. Based on GSP, Colorado had the second fastest growth rate in real inflation-adjusted GSP of all states. We were 3.6% and the US was 2.2%, so significantly higher. Largest contributors, nice high sector or high growth rates were IT sector and professional and technical, also real estate, construction, and healthcare. And a lot of those are very good paying jobs, professional jobs. So here you can see the growth was really concentrated along the West Coast. The West Coast just absolutely pretty much blew away the rest of the nation in terms of having the highest growth rates. Now, this I always like to point out. I think our ace in the hole for the state of Colorado is the diversity of sectors. And I'll talk a little more about how that is really starting to happen here locally as well in a few minutes. But we've had 12 sectors in 2017 with between 2 and 8.5% growth rate. And even if you take out mining, which is some of the uptick in oil and gas, we still have 11 sectors between 0 and 7%. Now, last year, I made some, a little joke about my husband being responsible for the second category there in fishing. And I'd like to say that now this year, this is quantifiable. You can see that his contribution, called the Canadian effect, is 6.8%. And that's us when we went to Aspen to go see Stevie Wonder with one of our sons. And we get out of the car the next day and he says, my fishing stuff's in the back of the truck. Imagine that, waders and all. So I said, go fishing, honey. Now, more recently, GDP growth, or GSP growth, across the United States, Q1 now, we're still in the number 2 slot. You can see at 4.5% growth so far this year. The only state beating us is Wyoming, but let's remember that Wyoming has 30% of its growth from the energy sector, whereas we have 12 sectors that are growing. So that makes us actually number 1 once again this year. So, as I mentioned before, the projections for 2018 are a little bit higher, 3.7% versus 3.6% of last year. And this isn't just optimism and the diversity of sectors. This is also due to a lot of other things called leading indicators. And in Colorado, they are very strong so far this year. We have high rate of new business formation. We have high tech sector growth, which has a very large multiplier. A lot of those dollars come from outside the state. High job postings, which continue, and even now some uptick in the oil and gas industry. In August, we had 125,000 open jobs in the state of Colorado. Wages grew from August to August by 5.2%. And then 1 in 5 jobs are in computer and mathematical occupations. So that tells you something about the type of economy that we have. And then here you can just see a picture of what these leading indices are showing us. Now, here you can also see in 2016, 17, and 18 that nice upward trend in new businesses, new business formation, and then the little graph underneath showing you how that's correlated with employment growth, right? Because small business is the fuel of all business growth moving forward. And then I do like to show this as well, that El Paso County is now in this high-tech corridor. And this is not made up by me. This is the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. And this is really and truly what is happening along the Front Range. Now, impact of tariffs on Colorado. So we have pretty much the same mix of countries that we export to as the US. But as Tim mentioned, the percent of our GDP that comes from exports in the US is 8%. In Colorado, it's a lot lower at 2.3%. So seemingly we have less exposure. What sectors are impacted the most? Well, agriculture, which is not a good thing because commodity prices have already been low for a long time. Aluminum, which isn't good for our microbrewing industry or for Sunday football. Industrial machinery, computers, basically, not good for a high-tech state either. Plastics and furniture. So those are the sort of the top 5 that we estimate would be impacted the most with especially China tariffs. But, you know, Arrow Electronics, one of the largest employers in the state of Colorado that deals with computers, came out right off the bat and said, well, if we don't resolve these tariffs, we're probably going to have to move out of the state of Colorado, and we're going to take about 1,000 jobs with us. So let's think about that for a second. That takes some high-paying jobs, employment decreases, our output decreases, our GSP, our #1 spot. The jobs potentially go to another country, and then that country benefits from tariffs that were supposed to help us out. So, you know, that's why 95% of the economists who understood the question actually said that they don't like tariffs. Now, another thing is, and this is really interesting, this really shows you how this is new territory in terms of trying to understand the impact of tariffs. The graph shows the Office of State Planning and Budgeting from Colorado saying that less than 2% of Colorado jobs are from the export sector. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Then you have the U.S. Commerce Department saying that 734,000 jobs in the state of Colorado are going to be impacted by trade. Now, are these direct jobs? Are they maybe jobs that are touched by it? I think that's where some of the gray comes in, but we don't really know what the downstream effects are going to be of intermediary goods, the supply chain. It's not just the finished product, especially in today's global economy. We also don't know what happens to supplementary goods and complementary goods and how their prices might be impacted. So if those 734,000 jobs are impacted, that's about 1/4 of all jobs in the state of Colorado. And always remember the big picture, right? World trade is 55% of world GDP. That's how global we are today. State employment. So, as I mentioned earlier, we continue to have a nice low unemployment rate in the state of Colorado, August 3.4%. And you can see that the Office of State Planning and Budgeting continues to say that we're going to be at a very low unemployment rate. I'm forecasting something a little bit higher for us locally, which I'll talk about more in a minute. This funnel is exactly what you'd like to see in terms of employment, in terms of GSP. Look at all of the different sectors that are represented here and that make up the entire employment pool. So first one is healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food, retail, trade, education, professional and technical, construction, and so forth. Employment was up 56,000 new jobs in the state of Colorado. 90% of them basically along the Front Range. And as long as that continues to happen, we're going to continue to have new people moving to the state in migration. Updated numbers, July to July, and these get updated more frequently than the quarterly numbers, but look at the job gains July to July, 78,000, with the largest sector being professional and business services. And then this just shows our supply-demand or demand-supply ratio here. If you look all the way to the right, statewide, for every open job, we have 0.8 individuals. It has inched up from April to July, and then Colorado Springs has inched up even more, but that's mostly because of an interesting phenomenon of so many people in the state of Colorado, including locally, entering or re-entering the labor force. So if you look August to August in Colorado, the number of people in the labor force increased by 83,000 people, up 2.8%. But the number of unemployed only increased by 700. I mean, this is pretty much as good as it gets. And coincidentally, total employment from August to August actually grew by 84,000, almost the same number of new people coming into the labor force as we had in total job growth. That is really a secret sauce kind of thing in terms of continuing to grow the economy without sort of overdoing it with the unemployment rate. And this is, of course, good because businesses, albeit hard, they can still find employees. Good because it raises our overall productivity, and good because it reduces our transfer payments like unemployment and Medicaid, right? Now, part of this secret sauce is also that we are considered to be one of the more business-friendly states. According to the Tax Foundation, we were ranked number 8, looking at the 2018 data that they've already amassed. Another ranking put us at number 5, high on all indices except 3 things. Cost of doing business, which is Denver, Boulder in particular, getting very expensive for space there. Cost of living, again, mostly Denver, Boulder, and somewhat increasingly us. And then infrastructure, no surprise. Now, a little bit on demographics. Here, just to show the green bars is the state of Colorado. We have been about double the national average, the orange line, in terms of population growth rate. Here you can see in 1990, Colorado had 3.3 million people. Now we have 5.7 million. And by 2050, we'll have about 8.5 million people. You can see that most of it comes from net migration, the red portion of the bar, people moving here. You can't blame them, right? The thing that I would like to highlight too is at the bottom right, Denver is the most populous county until 2019. Next year, not city comparison, county comparison, Denver will be overtaken by El Paso County at 723,994 people, which is pretty incredible. I know that was for my numbers. But anyway, domestic net migration, here you can see that the hot spots are the dark green. And you can see along the Front Range, and look at right smack in the middle of Colorado is El Paso County. And to give it some context here, in 2017, the percent of the population moving from a different state in the US was 2.3%. In Colorado, 4.1%, and El Paso County, 7.1%. Now, some of that probably is the military, but it's also people moving here of all age groups, really. And then, of course, diversity. By 2050, we're going to have about 60% of kids being either Hispanic, Black, Asian, or another minority, and then quite robust representation throughout the other age cohorts as well. And then just a last note on state here to talk about the general fund budget for the state of Colorado. You can see that by far the largest part of the pie is K-12 education at 38%. And then next one is healthcare. Kind of makes you think again about those structural issues, right? Healthcare and education. And then I always get asked, well, what about the marijuana taxes? Well, for this fiscal year, they're estimated to be about $250 million in total marijuana taxes, retail and medical. A little over a year ago, I wrote a 5-part series for the Business Journal looking at the health effects and safety effects and so forth. And let me tell you, we spent a whole lot more than $250 million in just health and safety. So, you know, as Governor Hickenlooper says, don't do it for the tax reasons necessarily. Now, Taco Bell sales have definitely gone up in the state of Colorado. And as we know, In-N-Out Burger is now coming to Colorado because they saw this graph. So anyway, back to being somewhat serious. K-12, this is the updated numbers with 2015. They lag a couple of years. But this is an important thing to keep in mind, right? In 1982, spending more than the national average per pupil, and then fast forward to 2015, spending almost $2,200 less than the national average in terms of per pupil expenditures in the state of Colorado. But we're either number 1 or number 2, depending on who you ask, in terms of gross state product. So there's a mismatch there for sure. And then this also ekes into higher education, right? Across the US, the student paid portion of tuition is about 46%, and look at Colorado, it's 70%, making it harder for our kids to pursue post-secondary education. We will be getting a Tabor refund. You saw in that graph I showed you the different taxations that have impacted the largest part of the pie, education. In fiscal year 2019-2020, joint filers will get a refund of $64. I know I'd be willing to pay $64 for one better commute on I-25 to and from Denver, and I think a lot of people probably would. Colorado real estate. The only thing I'll mention here is that we are part of now the dubious, in that dubious group of the top 10 in terms of being the 10 most expensive states. This is a little bit dated. This is a year old, but you can see how we are moving up, and that is an area of concern. Now, our local economy. So here you can see now I have GMP for us, Colorado Springs, the blue line. It's 2016 when we started to outperform even the state of Colorado. And now we're pretty much on a parallel path. You can see that my growth rates are almost identical to that of the state, about a percentage point higher than the US. And you know, annual growth rates of 3.5%, 3.7% are really quite good. Here are the metropolitan areas, the cities that have done the best across the United States. You can see the Front Range. Part of the reason the forum is now done at the beginning of October is because the GMP numbers come out at the very end of September, so for the previous year. So in 2017, our growth rate, inflation adjusted, was 3.3%, whereas for the US it was 2.1%. So we significantly outperformed the US. The sectors that grew the most across the U.S., this is for all cities that grew, 80% of them had growth in professional and business services, the cities that are doing well, wholesale and retail trade, finance and insurance, natural resources and mining. And last year, we ranked 83rd out of almost 400 cities, 383. And this year, we moved up to 58th, just like I thought, although that's even a bigger jump than I hoped for. Here you have the sectors that contribute most to our growth and to our total output. We have finance, insurance, and real estate. Professional and business services moved up to number 2 this past year. Federal military, number 3, and so forth. And then I was kind of curious, how has this changed in the last 15 years or so? So if you go back to 2001, look at the jump we've had in professional and business services from 2001 to 2017, from 12% to 14.5%. Given all the other sectors that we have here and that have experienced growth, 14.5%, that jump is actually pretty significant. Healthcare has also jumped up, and military's contribution has actually come down relatively as these other sectors have increased. What about our exposure to potential trade wars? Well, we're about the same as Colorado in terms of our total output attributable to exports, but we have a larger exposure to Asia, so we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. And then consumer sentiment, something that I think is really important in terms of understanding how confident people are, how much they're going to be willing to buy homes, cars, and so forth. We've been on a nice steady increase for vehicle registrations. That's one indicator. I think another really good one actually is luxury utility in the box there, because people spend money on luxury goods when they're particularly confident. 6.3% increase in the past year. Sales and use tax, also nice upward trend, 8.2% increase August to August. But now we have even something better. This local company, Elevated Insights, once a year conducts a survey, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics does nationally, but not usually locally, so this is nice. They actually found, comparing, now they use University of Michigan to benchmark against for the US. Currently, ours is a little bit lower than the US, 18% lower. But if you ask them about future expectations, how confident are you about next year, the next 5 years, and so forth, they're 28% higher, which of course pulled up the overall index to be 9 percentage points higher. I mean, that's really astounding because we're already so high in the US. I think this is really interesting because this is kind of indicative of where we are. We're sort of at a pivot point right now where people say, yeah, things are pretty good right now. They're actually better than they've been, but boy, are they ever heading in the right direction. And I think that's pretty accurate and also borne out in the data. Now, local employment. Here you have all the different unemployment rates. And in today's paper and recently, you've noticed that EPC, El Paso County, the unemployment rate is ticked up a little bit, and people think, oh, is something wrong here? Well, I'll talk more about that in a second, but that is part of the reason that you'll see my forecasts up there to have unemployment rates that are a little bit higher than Colorado, not as high as the U.S. at 3.5 and 3.7%. Still very low unemployment rates, nothing to be concerned about necessarily, but why? And I'll talk more about that in a second. Now, if you look at July to July, some of the preliminary data that's coming out, the employment growth rate across Colorado is 2.9%. For Colorado Springs, much higher at 4.9%. Greeley did beat us out, but they are mostly oil and gas, right? So here you can see July to July, the different cities in the state of Colorado and their growth rates. You can see Colorado Springs has had a nice jump in the last year, so has Denver and Pueblo. But the last time I checked, 1.9 and 3.2 were lower than 3.9, so we're actually number one. And we have more sectors represented. So. And then employment by sector, here you can see these are the number of employees and the proportion that they represent in total employment. Healthcare is the number one employer here locally, much like the US. Military is number two in terms of employment. Retail, accommodation, and food, that's a lot of our tourism industry, professional and technical services, and so forth. A lot of the clusters that we're really paying attention to moving forward and have been. And then these are the sectors that have grown the most, Q1 to Q1, 2017 to 2018. Healthcare and social assistance, 2,000 new jobs. Professional and technical, 1,400 new jobs. Construction, accommodation, and food. Very similar to what the growth we've seen in the US, if you remember that slide. And then, always nice to back up my optimism with the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. Between basically now and 2027, these are the occupational groups that they think are going to grow the most in Colorado based on trends. And I would generally agree with them. These are a lot of the ones that we've been seeing growth in. Their total projected job growth is about 60,000 employees gained. That's pretty robust at a 1.8% average increase per year. Almost identical to the Colorado one now. We did not used to be as high as Colorado. Theirs is 1.9%. And then if you juxtapose that to population growth, our job growth rate is a little bit higher than our population growth rate of 1.7%. And then this I have in my dashboard. I think this is always nice to benchmark. How many new jobs do we need in order to match this amazing population growth? And that is the dotted line that you see up there. It's about 5,400 jobs. And since 2013, we've been meeting that threshold. From 16 to 17, we had 6,300 new jobs. So we're not quite as big as we were in 15 and 16, but doing really still quite well. And then prospectively, looking at the job postings moving forward, in September we had 13,000 open jobs in Colorado Springs MSA. Average job is open for a month. The median salary, as Mayor Suthers pointed out, is $78,000, higher than the Colorado median. And look at how much lower that was in April of 2015, about $55,000. So that really tells you something about how much we've moved as a state and locally. And then Mayor Suthers showed this slide with some data from the forum and the Pikes Peak Workforce Center. And people, you know, it's kind of almost hard to believe, like how could our median salary for posted jobs, not existing jobs, but posted jobs prospectively be higher than Denver? So I looked at the data, and it's actually pretty intuitive once you look at it. The vast majority of our posted jobs are in professional categories. You look at the Denver postings now, not always and not necessarily the entire pool of employment, but right now it's a lot of tellers and restaurant workers and so forth. So right now we're hiring more professional jobs than we are those types of middle and lower skilled jobs. That also tells me we're at a pivot point here locally. We are at a point where we are transforming into more of a high tech, high skill economy, and it's reflected in these numbers. And then here you have the job postings for September. As I mentioned, you know, a lot of them are professional, the blue ones, but then also look at the labor supply. It has inched up, absolutely. We used to have more job postings than people looking for work, and now it's the opposite. So the interesting phenomenon in Colorado is also here locally. After decades of stagnant growth in the labor force, August to August, we had 13,000 new entrants into the labor force in El Paso County, and that's driving up our unemployment rate. And if you trended it back to 2000, we had a 30, maybe almost 31% increase in the labor force, but our working age population increased by more than that. It increased by 35%. So we were not keeping up. But if you look at the right of the graph there, you can see where it's finally started to tick up, and that's really where our economy started to take off. And there you can see, I've kind of honed in on that part of the graph, the increase in the labor force in the past 4 years has been 13%, but the increase in the working age population has only been 6%. So there you have what is going on with the labor force in El Paso County. And then I, last year talked about this new resource that the community put together, the Workforce Asset Map. And I think it's a great testament to us as a community looking at the structural issue of trying to get people trained for the jobs of today, understanding what those jobs are, and then all the resources to help place them into those jobs. One of the things, the part of the vision of this group was, once we've got this tool up and going, which is getting very good traction now, why don't we audit how many open jobs there are and how many local graduates we have? So we started with healthcare, and here you can see there are 6 categories that are in the top 10, top 15, all healthcare. The first column shows you the number of junior level openings in those jobs. The next column shows you all levels, because we're thinking junior is probably where your recent grads are going to go, right? And then the third column tells you how many graduates we have in those groups. So we had almost 5,400 job openings in all of 2017 for registered nurse, but only 190 graduates. So that tells you something about the shortage in healthcare in the nation as a whole and also here locally. And then, economists can only do simple subtraction, demand minus supply, 5,200, but that really does tell you something about the unmet need. It's very hard to snap your fingers as a higher ed institution and say, let's create these new slots. That takes time and a lot of money, but it is a good compass for us in terms of where we should be headed. Local wages. That's also something that we need to pay attention to here locally. You can see that for all of 2017, private jobs, El Paso County average salary was quite a bit lower at $48,000 versus Colorado at $57,000 and US at $55,000. So we were about 17% lower than the state of Colorado and about 14% lower than the US. That's going to have to change if we're going to continue to be competitive, especially in this tight labor market. We are moving in the right direction, but we started at a low baseline, so we have a long ways to go. And then local demographics. We are one of the 5 counties projected to have the most growth, 400,000 additional people in our county by 2050. You can see trending it back. We've basically doubled our population in the county, going back to 2000. So by 2050, we're projected to have about 1.1 million people in El Paso County alone. We are luckily still younger than the US and Colorado. US is 38, El Paso County is 34, and that is also a huge asset in terms of workforce. All of the age categories, this is updated just recently, all of the age categories are still projected to increase, except for the 50 to 64-year-olds. But really the prime working ages, 25 to 29, those millennials, they are increasing, 0 to 17, 30 to 49, and so forth. And there's been a lot in the press about Colorado Springs and the growth of millennials. I always look at them a little bit critically. I always think, is this, the People magazine? What is it? But really, this is from Brookings Institute, and they looked at census data from 2010 to 2015. And it's true, Colorado Springs is in the #1 spot in terms of percentage growth rate for millennials. And this is 18 to 34-year-olds. And we even beat out Denver in the #3 spot. And I just like to point out that Ohio has 3 in the bottom 10. But that's not surprising to some of us. And then here you can see that Rebecca and I also looked at this data ourselves, and we said, okay, well, let's just map out what's been the in-migration in Colorado Springs by age group, and look at that spike children, and then 20 to 24 and 25 to 29-year-olds, which is really, really astounding and a huge, huge asset for us as well. Now, everyone knows last year I joked around about spoiled millennials, and, Sam was a recent grad, and, are they an asset really? I mean, and, we can joke about it. Here he is at his first job, but I'm very happy to report that Sam now has a new job. This is his old job. His new job, I believe, is called Fortnite. That's what he tells me, not sure. But there he is, working hard. No, in all seriousness, there he is. Look at him. This is definitely an asset. Sam Elliott, the professional. He's got 3 screens. I don't even have 3 screens. I have 2 screens. So this goes to tell you that these millennials really are a huge asset for us, and Sam is a great example. Another asset that I think we have is the high proportion of veterans. This is, we're about double the rate in Colorado. We had 85,000 veterans, military veterans in 2017. In terms of workforce, these are incredible people that can also help us fill the huge skills gap, and that's something that we're addressing locally as well. And then we continue to be one of the most educated regions in the United States, especially in this some college or associate degree. We actually even beat Colorado for ages 25 plus. 35% of our population has some college or an associate degree, much higher than the US and Colorado. And I actually think the military does have something to do with that as well. In terms of bachelor's degree, 25 and higher, we're not quite as high as Colorado, but still significantly higher than the US, 39% versus 32%. And then a little bit on local housing. In Q2 for existing single-family homes, median price was $324,000 almost, up 14%. Remember I showed you the 5.3% for the US. US median was $269,000. We're now 20 percentage points higher in terms of median price. And then the supply in September was 2 months in the Pikes Peak region. Days on market was 27 days, so about a month. Denver's median price, it's all relative, right, was $463,000, up 9% Q2 to Q2. So we had a higher rate of increase, but of course we're still a lot less expensive. Boulder's median price, $631,000, up 6% Q2 to Q2. Boulder is now the 6th most expensive city for median home price, and Denver is 13th. We did move up in the rankings to 26th. Now remember that those top 10 to 15, many of them are, in that million and Boulder price range. And then, pretty different than the US graph now. We are much steeper in terms of our price increases post-recession. And again, an annual, this is new and existing homes, an annual graph, but then the bars show you where we are as of September, average and median price. And then the forecasts that I have with a lot of great input from builders, real estate agents, and so forth, is that the average price for new and existing homes in our region is going to be up 10.5% this year, and then up 6% next year, and then median price pretty similar. And then home sales to about level off, and this is part of the reason we're seeing the appreciation that we are in homes across the US and of course locally. They're gonna stay pretty stable is what I'm understanding from most of the people I talk to, and year to date that does seem to, the data does support that. And then the types of homes that are being sold. So here you can see that across the US, most homes are sold in that $100,000 to $250,000 range and $250,000 to $500,000 range. Locally for us, it's a little different. It's mostly in the $250,000 to $500,000 range. And then, stepping back from it, yes, we are increasing a lot. We are, as Mayor Suthers said, one of the most affordable, desirable places to live. It's all relative, right? At least so far, we are still doing pretty well with this thing called the Housing Opportunity Index. And it's basically looking at the median income within an area and comparing it to the median home price. What percentage of people can afford a home in that median price if they had the median income? And for us, it's still pretty high. It's 61%. So, Banning Lewis, other initiatives that we have out there to try and keep us this way is just that much more of an asset. Now, home building. I've always talked in the past about potentially having overbuilt in the early 2000s. Not too hard to figure out the healthy number of permits, which are about, they're actually 5,075 if you count up the number of households. And you can see that for the past couple of years, 16 and 17, we just met that threshold with single and multifamily construction. And then 18 and 19, we're going to surpass it a little bit, but still within a pretty comfortable range, but not any more huge jumps in terms of building. Why? Because with a lot of input that I've gotten from local builders, and also looking at what's happening nationally, there are some constraints in terms of construction costs and availability of labor, right? High material costs, high labor costs, and not as much zoned land as we would like. So in 2018, forecasting that 10% increase for single-family housing, and up only 0.2%, so basically level in 2019 is what I have heard from a lot of local builders. But remember, this is on top of an almost 20% increase in 2016 and a 6% increase in 2017. And maybe that's not a bad thing to be leveling off a bit in terms of not overbuilding. And then on the rental market, we've all seen that there's been a tremendous amount of new construction in multifamily homes. The average rent in Q2 was $1,157. We've about doubled in price since 2002. The average rent for newer units is even higher, about the same as Denver at $1,400. 1,500 units built in 2017 compared to only 528 in 2016. So really a lot of activity, especially in the northern part of town, it seems, and some downtown. And then here you can just see pictorially what's happening with vacancy rates and lease rates for apartments. Now, are we overbuilding in multifamily? I look very closely at Housing and Urban Development Report, which is across the nation, and they call us balanced, a balanced market as of Q2, because we have pretty good in terms of occupancy rates and absorption and so forth. And then here you can just see a little comparison for multifamily between Denver and Colorado Springs. And then just a couple of slides on commercial real estate. Of course, good economic times, a lot of growth. You can see that vacancy rates in all categories have come down. This has actually probably helped us that lease rates have not increased as much as they have for residential real estate. So yes, they've recovered a little bit, but pretty much the same as they were prior to the recession. The only category that has really gone up has been retail and industrial, and the other two are down, if anything. But the reason I call it an asset is because if you compare us to Denver, we're still about 40% cheaper for retail and medical office space, or medical office space, and then about 50% cheaper for just straight up office space, and about the same as in industrial. So that has, I think, probably also really helped us in terms of some of the business growth that we've seen here. And then lastly, tourism. We had 23 million visitors. Our tourism industry is doing very well. About half of them were overnight stays, so very good for the hotels that have been talked about. As Doug Price likes to say, the $2.3 billion that they spend is $73 a second. Amounted to about $100 million in tax receipts. And it used to be mostly family, but now it's more about attractions, which of course we're going to have more of. Very positive. And then occupancy rates are now about the same as they are in Denver, 85%. The RevPAR, which is the occupancy rate times the average room rate, so their profitability is up 33% in the past 3 years. Hotels doing very well. And then, of course, it helps us that our local airport is doing as well, with enplanements up a 14% increase July to July. And then, as Greg says, look before you book, because if you don't use it, you'll lose it, right? So we want to make sure that we pay attention to these different flights that we have available to us, because they are indeed an asset. And then my dashboard, for those of you who are sponsors, you know that I have a lot of this information I provide on a monthly basis. You can always talk to me later about becoming a sponsor if you're not one, but you also have trifolds that you are able to take home with you today. And that's just that information. And then the slides from today and from Mr. Quinlan will be posted on the UCCS Economic Forum website.